Hello, I'm Vic Maloy. It is April the 24th, 2020, the second week of Easter. This presentation was originally scheduled as a two-part Lenten series for St. Mary's Sunday Morning Forum. It was rescheduled into this format due to the coronavirus pandemic that has required all of us Virginians to shelter in place. Because of the relevance of the subject matter of this presentation, it was decided to make it available in this format and as a single presentation. After this presentation has been viewed, there will be an opportunity to submit questions and comments, which will be responded to in a follow-up recording. When Eleanor told me that the series was being named Good Grief, my reaction was good grief. But then I thought about almost immediately Nancy Friday's book, Necessary Losses, and thought, yes, while loss is not good in and of itself, the grieving of our losses is necessary for healing and the ability to embrace the future after loss. I will begin by talking about loss and grief as an overview. But I am ever so mindful that when I was with you during your last Lenten series, after 2 sessions, your committee said, Vic, you speak in beautiful and meaningful metaphors, but it would be helpful for you to give us some practical advice. So I will strive to provide some practical advice as it relates to both loss and grief, as well as the pandemic. I'll begin by telling you a story from my wife's experience working for a short time in a seminary, in a cemetery. And I will actually tell you 2 stories, the first of which I'll tell you now because I love the playfulness of it. The second story I will tell you toward the end of the presentation because it illustrates so well the importance of ritual in grief. Some years ago, my wife Susan was between jobs and was asked by our neighbor, who at the time managed a large cemetery, if she would come and work the front desk. Susan did and said that one day an elderly woman drove up in a large, expensive car, got out, went around to the back of the car, opened the trunk, and took out a small urn. The lady came into Susan's office, put the urn down decisively on her desk, and said, "This is my late husband, Henry. I've tried him in all the rooms of my house and he doesn't fit anywhere. Please do something with him." And so Susan did. And the elderly lady left quite finished with her grief. True story. The 18th century English pundit Samuel Johnson said, "The prospect of death wonderfully concentrates the mind." Wry as Johnson's observation is, it touches a fundamental truth, it seems to me, that from the earliest recorded times, we humans have been attempting to come to terms with death and loss. The earliest human rituals that can be identified by anthropologists are burial ceremonies. The very earliest are in caves in Iraq and Israel. And in one of those is a young mother on a stone platform, and crossways at her feet is the body of a young child. In another is a young man on a stone platform in a cave, and across his chest are antlers from a deer and some flowers. These early ritualized burials give us clear evidence of how early in human history loss and grief were recognized as part of the human experience. It is to say that we have been attempting to come to terms with our losses since at least the beginning of the prefrontal cortex of our brains, that part of the brain that gives us such amazing capacity for emotional complexity. And it is our losses and our capacity for grief that gives us so much in common with one another as persons. Across all other barriers that separate us, gender, age, culture, race, politics, economics, etc., we all have lost people, pets, things, and situations dear to us. Loss is one of the things that we most have in common with one another. It is part and parcel of the human experience. And such a variety of losses. In Stanley Kunit's Muse, he writes, "How shall the heart be reconciled to its feast of losses? The earliest of which occurs at birth and is a precursor of things to come. After 9 months of total dependence inside our mother's body, we have to leave. It is of no small significance that our first utterance at birth is a cry. The cry is, of course, related to having to breathe on our own for the first time, but perhaps it also is a cry of separation from the other, with whom we have been so intimately connected. And perhaps also it is a premonition cry for all the losses that are to come. And for some infants, as we know, there are losses experienced prior to birth. Genetic defects at conception, the impact of the mother's use of alcohol or drugs, abuse to the mother by her partner, emotional losses experienced by the mother during pregnancy, all of which we know can affect the infant in utero. So our losses begin early and continue in subtle and not subtle ways. Weaning, potty training, first day at school, death of a pet, parent separation or divorce, high school graduation, leaving home for college, the military, or a job, separation or divorce in our own lives and in the lives of our adult children, caretaking of aging parents, death of parents, death of a spouse or loss of a spouse to dementia or Alzheimer's, as well as the reality of our own mortality and eventual death. An awareness that in the end we lose our very selves and the preciousness of this that we call this life. A few years ago, I was at the Episcopal Retreat Center at Canoga, just up the mountain from Hendersonville, North Carolina. One of the speakers was Claud Evans, a former campus chaplain for many years at Southern Methodist University. Claud had been, not long before that presentation, diagnosed with early stage Alzheimer's, and he was presenting a series at that meeting of reflections on his condition. And he closed his final presentation by saying, "The prospect of death makes life shine so." Hearing Claude's words there at Canoga made me remember the story of Søren Kierkegaard, the story he told of a man who stumbles over the edge of a cliff, and as he is falling to his certain death, he manages to arrest his fall by grabbing a small bush that's growing out of the side of the cliff. And Kierkegaard says that as the man hangs there hundreds of feet above the ground, two things happen. The first is that the man sees a cluster of wild berries growing just out of arm's reach. And the second is that the man sees that the bush that is supporting him is slowly pulling loose from the face of the cliff. Kierkegaard says that in that moment, the man reaches out, plucks a berry, and puts it in his mouth. The instinct for life, even in the face of death. Some time ago, I was sitting on an airplane flipping through one of those in-flight magazines, and a title caught my eye. The title was, "We All Die Broke." And as my eye dropped to the byline, I was struck that it was written by the novelist Stephen King. It was an excellent and brief essay regarding what he had learned from a near-death experience. He had been struck by a motorist out jogging and had nearly died. During the months of recuperation, he had time to reflect on his life and its meaning. And he had come to the conclusion that no matter how much money he had, that he was in the final analysis going to die broke. And given that fact, how did he want to use his resources while he was still alive? Or as Wayne Mueller asked it, how shall I live knowing that I will die? You may know the life and writings of C.S. Lewis. If you've read Surprised by Joy or saw the movie adaptation Shadowlands, you'll remember the scene between C.S. Lewis and his wife, Joy Grisham. She has become ill with terminal cancer and does not have long to live. They go to visit a place called Paradise Valley, a painting of which had hung on the wall of Lewis's home when he was a child. And as they're walking, it begins to rain, and they take shelter in a barn. And they have this conversation about the meaning of their life together and Joy's approaching death. It's initiated by Joy because of Jack's, as she calls Lewis, because of Jack's emotional reserve and deep stoicism. Joy says, "That's your kind of happy, isn't it?" to something Lewis has just said. Yes, it is, he says. "It's not going to last, Jack," she says. "You should not think about that now. Let's not spoil the time we have together," he says. And she says, "It doesn't spoil it. It makes it real. Let me just say it before the rain stops and we go back." Lewis says, "What is there to say?" And Joy says, "I'm going to die, and I want to be with you then too. The only way I can do that is if I'm able to talk with you about it now." Lewis, in his stoic manner, says, "I can manage, don't worry about me." Joy says, "No, it can be better than that. I think it can be better than just managing, Jack. What I'm trying to say is that the pain then is part of the happiness now. That's the deal." And in the movie, the scene closes with the two of them having had that exchange, holding each other as the rain comes down around the barn. It is a conversation about bringing meaning to death and loss, not unlike Stephen King's essay or Claud Evans' observation that the prospect of death makes life shine so, or Kierkegaard's man on the cliff wall reaching out to pluck the berry. Time and again, the studies of grief and loss show that those who recover the best are those who give themselves ample opportunity to openly grieve, are able to create some sense of meaning out of the loss, and are able to eventually reinvest in the present and future. Finding opportunities to talk openly about one's loss and finding ways to ritualize the loss can be powerfully healing and help one embrace the future. When my mother died, one of her parting gifts to me was to ask me to conduct her service, though it did not feel like a gift at the time. In the moment, I thought, good grief, but not in a positive way. But in retrospect, my mother's request provided me with the experience of good grief. It gave me the opportunity to put together a service that was a very honest expression of her life, including her favorite singer, Elvis Presley, singing My Way, and turned out to be a powerful way for me to process and ritualize my loss and grief, as it has been since then, going through her possessions and her papers. On what would have been my mother's 98th birthday last month, I drove over to her gravesite on the eastern shore of Virginia, sat at her grave, remembered, shared some bourbon, and when I was ready to leave, sang happy birthday to her. The importance of rituals. At the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, there is a separate memorial for the 1 million Jewish children extinguished. It is a round building built into the ground. You enter it by walking down a ramp into the building that is partially buried. You enter a very dark building, and it takes a moment for your eyes to adjust to the darkness. And as your eyes begin to adjust, you slowly see points of light all the way around the room as you stand in the middle of that room. And in the center is one single source of light. Around the large dark room, mirrors are placed in such a way that they reflect the 1 million points of light, one for each lost child. And every minute, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, a lost child's name is softly spoken over a loudspeaker. It is an overwhelmingly sad and yet healing ritual. A ritual that is permanent and ongoing in nature. I worked for a long time with a couple. The husband and I have done public presentations together on the subject, so this is not a breaking of confidence. David and Jeannie came to see me after their 21-year-old son, Jamie, was shot and killed during a robbery in a restaurant. Week after week and month after month, I sat with them, often in silence, because often that was all I had to offer. And in the second year, they began to comprehend what had happened to them in terms of the magnitude of their loss. As that happened, they began to be able to use their grief to make a difference in their community. But always they cautioned about the rush toward closure and the tendency in our society to expect those who have suffered a loss to be okay in a relatively short period of time. David said the following in a workshop that he and I did. He said, when you leave this workshop, go to your office, pull out your dictionary, and look up the word closure. In my dictionary, he said, it is on page 225. Then, with a black pen, cross out the word and resist every impulse to use the word closure in the company of one who is grieving. After the sentencing of Jamie's killers, he said, a lady came up to me the following Sunday and said, I'm so glad the trials are over for you. Now you can get on with your life and have closure. And David said, my reply was, we came home and looked at Jamie's picture. He is still dead. And then David went on to say in that workshop, and so our journey continues to be a work in progress, as does the journey of anyone who grieves after a traumatic loss. Through all of this, I'm still getting to know the David who is learning to live life in a new context. Bottom line, what happened to our son, Jamie, has broken our hearts. But even in the face of this violent, senseless tragedy, a miracle is slowly emerging. It is that our hearts, though broken, are still beating. David and Jeannie found a way to embrace and not flee from their grief. So powerfully spoken to in the poem by Denise Levertov entitled Talking to Grief. She writes, "Ah, grief, I should not treat you like a homeless dog who comes to the back door for a crust, for a meatless bone. I should trust you. I should coax you into the house and give you your own corner, a worn mat to lie on, your own water dish. You think I don't know you've been living under my porch? You long for your real place to be ready before winter comes. You need your name, your collar, and tag. You need the right to warn off intruders, to consider my house your own, and me your person, and yourself my own dog." I once heard Rabbi Earl Grolman say that grief is love's struggle to let go. It is as good a description as I know. Hearts still broken, but still beating. And so Joy Grisham is right. That's the deal. The pain then is part of the happiness now. Hearts broken, but still beating. Some time ago, I was at Eastern Mennonite Seminary doing a series of readings from a book I wrote. The book is a collection of meditations on loss and redemption, my own for the most part. At the banquet one evening, at the table where I sat with 6 others, the conversation drifted to one of my readings earlier that day about the loss of one of our beloved rescued greyhounds, and my confession that I had grieved the loss of my dogs more than most of my people. One of the people at the table began to talk about the loss of his beloved dog some years earlier, and how his heart still felt so broken these years later that he could not bring himself to get another dog, a common feeling for many. Yet one of the other people at the table said without hesitation, "Our hearts are made to be broken. That's the deal." And I thought to myself, yeah, Joy Grisham is right. That's the deal. The pain then is part of the happiness now. Hearts broken, but still beating. If we are fortunate when we are grieving, when we've lost, caring people come to our rescue. People who only want to hold our hand, who bring food and flour, who sign notes simply, "Your broken-hearted friend," or who drive an hour, come to your house to simply and briefly hug you and leave you to be present to your loss. I, like you and millions of others in this season of being sequestered, are living with fear and anxiety and disorientation amid trying to adjust to new and strange ways of communicating, ways of doing our work while there's death and loss all around us. There is the loss of our personal and social freedom to come and go as we like, the loss of diminished social contact. There is the subtle mistrust of others in grocery stores and other public places that they could be carrying the virus. And beneath the mask, even when we smile at another, they are not able to see it, it's hidden from them. There is the disorientation of routines and schedules disrupted. There is the anxiety of what it means to be sequestered in our home for 2 or 3 months and what the future will look like. There are funerals and services that have to be delayed for perhaps months, or conducted in very restricted ways, making it harder to adequately possess one's loss and grief, and making proper rituals all the more important when they do take place. And of course, high school and college commencements that will not take place or will take place remotely. All of these factors are psychologically disorienting, making a sense of completion or closure very difficult. So as promised, I have a few concrete suggestions for managing ourselves during this difficult time, as well as in the aftermath of any significant loss. I think it is very important to structure our days so that the passage of time doesn't seem, as I've heard some say, like one endless day after another, or as several have said to me, like I am reliving the movie Groundhog Day. Keeping a regular bedtime and getting up at a regular time is part of that structure, as is regular and healthy meals with snacks and alcohol in moderation. Getting outdoors for exercise is very important. Reading those things that inspire can be very helpful. Limiting your exposure to social media, including television, is important. Twice a day for 30 minutes or an hour is enough. And if you're feeling particularly stressed, the 4-7-8 breathing approach is useful. Inhale deeply to the count of 4, hold it for the count of 7, exhale to the count of 8, repeat. That technique lowers heart rate, blood pressure, the stress hormone cortisol, and calms the limbic system of the brain. And the app called UCLA Mindful can also be very helpful, used regularly for treating stress and anxiety. And while contact with family and friends is facilitated by email and text, the human voice over the phone or through video is even more reassuring. And I've been struck in multiple conversations that I've had with individuals during the last several weeks, how many are taking delight in having time with family, being able to take long bike rides with children, spending time with family that is enhanced, that the quality of it is enhanced. And I've also been struck by the number of people who are contemplating what they're learning from this experience about themselves and what they're learning about their work and their work style and ways in which they want to take some of these learnings back into their work arena when the stay-at-home order is lifted and people begin to return to some version of what normalcy will be. And particularly for those working from home and experiencing Zoom fatigue, I have a few suggestions. It can be very useful to not plan meetings back to back. Give yourself at least 15 minutes between calls. Leave your desk, go outside or to a different area of the house and walk around. Clear your head. Between meetings, my office is upstairs. I go downstairs, I get water or coffee, I step outside, I clear my head before coming back for the next call. Because it's very important to recognize that video meetings are more tiring than in-person meetings. And that's for neurological reasons, which I won't go into here, but suffice it to say that, for instance, our tendency when we're in a video chat or on a Zoom conference call is to sit much more still than we would in a face-to-face meeting because we're attempting to stay in view of the camera on our computer. And so that takes energy to not move around as much as we would in a room with someone in a meeting. In addition, we're not used to watching ourselves as we relate to others. The little picture that's up in the right hand or left hand corner is also, it's distracting, and it also takes energy, and it moves us away from the focus of the conversation before us. And so I've begun to place a post-it note over the picture of myself during a call so that I'm not distracted looking at myself, thinking about my hair or my shirt or anything else at that point, so that I can totally focus on the person or persons in front of me. And some video platforms actually permit you to turn your on-screen picture off. One other suggestion is that if you can do some of your meetings by phone, do so. It will give you a welcome break from some of the video dilemmas I've just mentioned, and it will decrease the fatigue factor. Recently, I'd been on a 2.5-hour Zoom call with a group I consult with in Chicago, and one of the people wanted to talk with me later, and so I said, how about a phone call? And so when he picked up the phone a while later, he said, oh, thank you for suggesting the phone. This feels so much better than staring at the computer screen again. So just an example of modulating how you do your work from home, if you will. I come now to the second cemetery experience my wife Susan had. She said that she had grown increasingly when she was working there at the front desk of the cemetery. She had grown increasingly concerned about a middle-aged man whose wife had recently died and was buried on a hill in the cemetery. She said the man would come every day for weeks and lie on or beside his wife's grave. Susan could see him out of her office window. And then one day, she said, after many weeks, there was a large graveside service across the way from where the man's wife was buried. It was an African-American service with much singing, hand clapping, and praise. And Susan said, as that hand clapping and singing and praise took place, she watched out of her office window, saw the man get up off his wife's grave and slowly make his way over to the group singing and clapping, and she watched him merge into the crowd. And then Susan said, he never came back to the cemetery after that, and that she thought he had been trying to find a way all those weeks to more fully grieve, and this grieving group of nearby strangers afforded him a community in which to grieve openly and with others who also were grieving. My learning from Susan's story is that it is never too late to find proper rituals through which to say goodbye and to grieve our losses. I close with some words of faith and I hope. Those of us of faith do believe that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness has not overcome it. A colleague, Jim Harnash, has written an article entitled Hope in a Place of Death. He writes of another side of the COVID-19 crisis that is taking place at one of the epicenters of the crisis, Mount Sinai Hospital in Manhattan. And Jim writes, this week, the daughter of one of my longtime friends, an original member of the clergy group I participated in for nearly 4 decades, gave birth to a baby girl in the obstetrics ward at Mount Sinai Hospital. When the new grandfather shared the news, I responded, a gift of joy and life in a time of despair and death. Praise God. Jim goes on to compare this virus to the great influenza epidemic of 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. And he says, we know how many people died in that epidemic, but we forget that babies were born that year also. And then Jim lists a few who were born in the midst of that epidemic in 1918, and here they are. Nelson Mandela, Katherine Johnson, Billy Graham, Nipsey Russell, Ted Williams, Leonard Bernstein, Art Carney, Pearl Bailey, Sam Walton, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Anwar Sadat. And then Jim says, the list goes on, but it's enough to say that some of the world's best people were born in one of the worst years in world history. Their births in no way diminish the tragedy of the flu epidemic, but they are at least a small sign of hope in a dark time. There's no way to deny or overstate, Jim writes, the dark shadow that hangs over us now, any more than the birth of one child at Mount Sinai cancels out the suffering and death that occurs there as well. We live with both at the same time. The only way to resurrection is the way that leads to the cross. But we make this journey and we live this life not in despair, but with hope. It is surely what Paul meant when he wrote, we do not grieve as those who have no hope. In Leicester, England, there is an inscription on the outside wall of an old church that reads, in the year 1654, when all things were throughout this nation either demolished or profaned, Sir Robert Shirley, Baronet, founded and built this church. He it is whose singular praise it is to have done the best things in the worst times and to have hoped them in the most calamitous. To have done the best things in the worst times and to have hoped them in the most calamitous. It is the same hope in the face of loss and grief that Wendell Berry points to in his poem, and I shall close with it. He writes, when despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in the fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down in the place where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the reach of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the place of still water. I sense above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. And for a time, I rest in the grace of the world, and I am free. Blessings to you and to yours in all the days ahead. I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have. Blessings.